The steel door of maximum security enclosure number 4 didn't just rattle, it bucked under the weight of a 100-pound apex predator. "He'll tear your throat out, Thomas," the head behaviorist warned, his voice trembling as his thumb hovered over the emergency tranquilizer trigger. Thomas Mitchell couldn't see the scarred, foaming German shepherd on the other side of the chain-link fence. The former Navy SEAL had lost his sight to a blast in Kandahar 3 years ago, but he didn't need eyes to recognize the familiar, suffocating aura of a soldier who had lost his war. "Open the gate," Thomas whispered. Silence is a heavy thing when you have too much of it. For 34-year-old Thomas Mitchell, silence was the canvas on which his nightmares painted themselves. 3 years prior, Thomas was a point man for DevGru Navy SEAL Team 6. He was a man who lived by the precision of his vision. He could spot a tripwire in the moonlight. He could read the micro-expressions of a terrified informant in a dimly lit alley in Helmand Province. Then came the IED on a dirt road in the Arghandab River Valley. The blast took 2 of his teammates. It took the left side of his jaw, requiring intensive reconstructive surgery at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. And it took his eyes. Now, Thomas lived in a cabin in the foothills of the Colorado Rockies, a self-imposed exile. His world was entirely tactile and auditory. It was the scrape of his white cane against the hardwood floor, the smell of brewing black coffee, and the phantom echoes of gunfire that still rang in his ears when the wind howled down from the mountains. He had survived the blast. But the Thomas Mitchell, who enlisted at 18, had died on that dirt road, 200 miles away, at the Freedom Forge K-9 Rescue and Rehabilitation Center in Denver. Another veteran was living in exile. His name was Titan. Titan was a purebred German shepherd. Bred in the Netherlands, and trained by the United States Navy to be a multi-purpose canine. He was a missile with teeth, capable of jumping out of C-130S at 30,000 feet strapped to a handler, capable of sniffing out explosive compounds buried 3 feet in the dirt. Titan had served for 4 years. He had 42 successful combat operations on his record. But Titan's record ended abruptly in a compound outside of Mosul. His handler, Petty Officer First Class Chris Norton, was pinned down by heavy enemy fire. Chris took a fatal round to the neck for 14 hours, until the quick reaction force could finally break through. Titan stood over Chris's body. The dog took shrapnel to his left flank and a grazing bullet to his ear, but he refused to let anyone near his handler. When the medevac finally arrived, Titan's mind had snapped. He couldn't differentiate friend from foe. He nearly mauled the medic trying to load Chris into the helicopter. Since that day, Titan had been passed from military kennels to specialized behaviorists, and finally to Freedom Forge, a sanctuary for unadoptable military and police dogs. He was labeled a Level 5 risk. Dr. Alex Pendleton, the lead veterinary behaviorist at the center, stood outside Titan's reinforced concrete kennel, holding a clipboard with a grim finality. Titan was pacing endlessly in figure eights, his heavy paws slapping the concrete, a deep, rumbling growl vibrating in his chest with every breath. The dog's coat was patchy, where scar tissue interrupted the black and tan fur. His amber eyes were wide, dilated, and paranoid. "It's not just aggression, Eleanor," Dr. Pendleton said, looking at the facility's director, Eleanor Moore. "It's profound PTSD. He's stuck in a perpetual state of combat. He attacked Handler Davis yesterday just for holding a clipboard too quickly. He's 100 pounds of lethal force. And he's suffering." Eleanor, a woman who had dedicated her life to saving broken dogs, wiped a tear from her cheek. "There has to be someone. Another handler. Someone who understands him. We've brought in 3 former K-9 handlers," Alex replied softly. "He tried to put 2 of them in the hospital. The military washed their hands of him. We are out of options, Eleanor. The board has reviewed his case. Euthanasia is scheduled for this Friday. It is the most humane thing we can do. We cannot save a dog that wants to kill everyone who tries to help him." Inside the cage, Titan threw his massive body against the chain link, his jaws snapping at the empty air between him and the humans. He wasn't acting out of malice. He was acting out of an unbearable, blinding terror. In Titan's mind, he was still in that dusty courtyard in Mosul, the smell of copper and death in the air, waiting for an enemy that never stopped coming. The following Tuesday, a heavy Ford F-150 crunched onto the gravel driveway of Thomas Mitchell's cabin. The horn blared twice. Thomas, sitting on his porch with a cold cup of coffee, didn't flinch. He recognized the heavy tread of the boots stepping out of the truck long before the man spoke. "You look like hell, Tommy," Chief Petty Officer Ryan Garner said, leaning against the wooden railing of the porch. Ryan was one of the few men from Thomas's old platoon still stateside, and the only one stubborn enough to ignore Thomas's demands to be left alone. "I'm blind, Ryan." "I don't need a mirror to know I look like a corpse," Thomas replied flatly. "What do you want?" "I'm taking you to Denver. Get your coat and your stick. I'm not going to a VA group therapy session so we can sit in a circle and talk about our feelings," Thomas growled, his knuckles whitening around his cane. "It's not the VA," Ryan said. "It's a place called Freedom Forge. It's a rescue center. My sister-in-law volunteers there. They've got military working dogs." I thought, "I don't know, man. I thought maybe being around some guys who actually speak your language might do you some good. Even if they have 4 legs." Thomas fought the idea for 20 minutes. But Ryan's stubbornness was legendary in the teams. Eventually, Thomas found himself strapped into the passenger seat, the miles of highway rolling away unseen beneath them. When they arrived at Freedom Forge, the sensory onslaught hit Thomas immediately. His blindness had hyper-tuned his remaining senses. He could smell the sharp, clinical odor of veterinary disinfectant mixed with the earthy, musky scent of dozens of dogs. But more than that, he could hear the anxiety. The barking wasn't just noise. It was a complex tapestry of emotions. He heard the sharp, high-pitched barks of dogs wanting attention, the deep, rhythmic barks of territorial defense, and the frantic whining of separation anxiety. Eleanor Moore met them in the lobby. "Mr. Mitchell, Ryan told us you were coming. We're honored to have you here. We have several dogs who were trained in basic obedience, looking for forever homes." "I'm not looking for a pet, ma'am," Thomas said, his voice low, his posture rigid. "My buddy just dragged me here so I wouldn't rot in my own living room." Eleanor offered a sympathetic smile, though Thomas couldn't see it. "Well, let me show you around anyway." They began walking down the main corridor. Ryan walked slightly ahead, offering brief descriptions of the dogs they passed. Thomas just listened, his cane tapping a rhythmic click-clack on the linoleum. Suddenly, a sound tore through the facility that made the hairs on the back of Thomas's neck stand up. It came from a heavy steel door at the end of the hall, the isolation ward. It wasn't a bark. It was a roar. It was a guttural, terrifying sound that rattled the acoustic tiles in the drop ceiling. Instantly, all the other dogs in the facility went dead silent. "What the hell was that?" Ryan asked, taking a subconscious step backward. Eleanor sighed, her voice tight with sorrow. "That's Titan. He's a special case. Former Navy. He was in Mosul. He sounds like he wants to eat through the steel," Ryan muttered. Thomas stopped walking. He turned his head perfectly toward the heavy steel door. His sightless eyes were fixed on the source of the sound. He didn't hear a monster. To a civilian, the roar sounded like pure, unadulterated aggression. But Thomas had spent years in war zones. He knew the difference between a predator hunting and a soldier taking fire. The pitch of the growl, the frantic pacing he could hear on the concrete floor, the sudden snapping barks, it wasn't an offensive maneuver. It was defensive. It was a frantic, terrifying perimeter defense. "He's terrified," Thomas said softly. Dr. Alex Pendleton, who had just stepped out of an adjacent office, scoffed slightly. He's highly dangerous, Mr. Mitchell. He's a level 5 aggressive with unmanageable PTSD. He has severely injured 2 highly trained handlers since arriving here. Thomas gripped his cane. Who was his handler? Petty Officer Chris Norton, Eleanor answered quietly. Killed in action. Thomas felt a cold shockwave hit his chest. Norton. He knew Norton. They hadn't been on the same team, but they had shared a tarmac in Bagram a few years back. Norton was a good kid, a dedicated handler. Take me to him, Thomas said. Absolutely not, Dr. Pendleton intervened immediately. Titan is in lockdown. He is scheduled for euthanasia on Friday. No one goes near that cage except me, and I only do it to slide his food bowl under the safety slot. He is a lethal liability. Thomas stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the doctor. Though he was blind, Thomas was 6'2", built like a brick wall, and still carried the intimidating presence of a Tier 1 operator. Doc, Thomas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy calm. You look at him, and you see a broken piece of equipment that needs to be thrown away. I hear a brother who is trapped behind enemy lines. Take me to him. The corridor leading to the isolation ward was suffocatingly quiet, save for the frantic, heavy breathing echoing from enclosure number 4. As Eleanor, Alex, Ryan, and Thomas approached, the smell changed. The disinfectant was replaced by the acrid, metallic scent of adrenaline and fear, a scent Thomas knew intimately from the insides of medevac helicopters. We stop here, Doctor, Pendleton ordered, standing a good 10 feet away from the chain-link front of the kennel. Any closer, and he'll throw himself against the wire. He's already damaged his teeth doing it. Thomas ignored him. He kept walking, sweeping his white cane side to side until the plastic tip clinked against the bottom of the chain-link gate. Instantly, the kennel erupted. Titan launched himself from the back of the concrete run. 100 pounds of muscle, teeth, and fury slammed into the fence directly in front of Thomas. The heavy-gauge steel wire bowed outward. Titan's jaws snapped just inches from Thomas's face, the sound like a steel trap slamming shut. Foam flew from the dog's mouth, his roars deafening in the enclosed space. "Tommy, back away!" Ryan yelled, his combat instincts flaring as he rushed forward to grab his friend's shoulder. Thomas didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He didn't step back. He stood perfectly still, his hands resting on the grip of his cane, letting the dog's explosive rage wash over him. For 30 seconds, Titan raged. He barked until his voice hoarsened, lunging at the wire, trying to tear through the barrier to eliminate the perceived threat. Thomas just stood there. He breathed in slowly through his nose, out through his mouth. He centered himself, falling back into the deep meditative breathing taught in BUD. S to slow the heart rate in freezing water. Slowly, Titan's barks began to falter. The dog dropped to all fours, panting heavily, confused. Every person who had ever approached his cage had reacted. They flinched, they yelled, they raised their hands, they radiated fear or dominance. This man was doing neither. This man was a statue. "He's waiting for me to attack," Thomas said quietly, speaking over Titan's heavy panting. "He's trying to preempt the strike. Norton died because the enemy got the drop on them. Titan made a promise to himself that no one would ever get the drop on him again." "Mr. Mitchell, please step back," Eleanor pleaded, terrified. "Open the gate." The silence that followed in the hallway was heavier than the dog's roaring. "Are you insane?" Dr. Pendleton snapped. "I will not facilitate a suicide. He will kill you, Mr. Mitchell. That is not an exaggeration. He has the jaw pressure to snap your femur, and he knows exactly how to take down a human target. Doc, if you don't open that gate, I'm going to find the latch myself," Thomas said calmly. He reached down and collapsed his white cane, folding the sections together and slipping it into his jacket pocket. He was deliberately removing anything that could be perceived as a weapon. "Ryan, talk some sense into him," Eleanor begged the chief petty officer. Ryan looked at Thomas. He saw the set of his jaw, the rigid posture. Ryan had seen that exact look before Thomas kicked down doors in Fallujah. "Doc," Ryan said, his voice tight, "open the damn door. I've got my sidearm in my truck. If this goes south, I'll put the dog down myself." "I am not unlocking that door," Pendleton yelled. "Eleanor," Thomas said, turning his head slightly toward where he heard her breathing. "Friday, right? You're going to put him in a bag on Friday. He gave everything for this country. He stood over a bleeding American hero for 14 hours. And his reward is a needle in a cold room? You owe him this. Open the gate." Tears streamed down Eleanor's face. Her hands shook violently as she pulled the master key ring from her belt. She stepped past Dr. Pendleton, who was protesting furiously, and inserted the heavy brass key into the padlock of enclosure 4. Click. She pulled the padlock free and unlatched the heavy steel slide bolt. "Stand back. All of you. Do not make a sound, no matter what happens," Thomas ordered. Thomas pushed the chain-link door open. It creaked loudly on its hinges. He stepped into the kennel. He was entirely blind. He was in a 10 by 10 concrete box with a lethal weapon that had forgotten how to be a dog. As Thomas stepped in, Titan froze. The dog's ears pinned flat against his skull. The hackles on his back stood up like a mohawk. A low, demonic growl started in his belly and vibrated through the floorboards, traveling up through the soles of Thomas's boots. Thomas didn't reach his hand out. He didn't try to baby talk the dog. He knew K9S. They didn't respect pity. They respected presence. Thomas squared his shoulders, stood up straight, and clasped his hands behind his back in a standard military parade rest. Titan bared his teeth. He lowered his head. His powerful hind legs coiled beneath him like springs. He was ready to launch. He was ready to kill. "I know, buddy." Thomas spoke into the darkness, his voice deep, resonant, and completely devoid of fear. "It's dark, it's loud, and everybody you love is gone." Titan barked once, a sharp, deafening crack of sound, and charged. Outside the cage, Eleanor screamed. Dr. Pendleton lunged for the door. Ryan froze in horror. Titan closed the distance in a fraction of a second, launching his 100-pound frame off the concrete, aiming directly for Thomas's chest. Thomas didn't move a muscle. He didn't brace for impact. He just stood there, accepting whatever was coming, midair. Something in Titan's brain misfired, or perhaps finally fired correctly. The dog didn't smell fear. He didn't smell a threat. As he hurtled toward the man, he caught the scent of old gun oil, leather, and the unique, deep-seated musk of a fellow warrior. He saw the posture, the exact posture Chris used to take when they were standing down after a raid. A foot away from Thomas's chest, Titan twisted violently in the air, aborting the attack. He crashed onto the concrete beside Thomas's boots, his claws scrambling frantically for purchase. The dog spun around, teeth bared, confused and panicked. He growled at Thomas, but he didn't lunge. He paced a tight circle around the blind man. Not process. Thomas slowly unclasped his hands from behind his back. He let his right hand drop to his side, his palm open, fingers relaxed. He didn't reach for Titan. He just offered the space. "It's over, Titan," Thomas whispered. Titan stopped pacing. He stood inches from Thomas's hand, his massive chest heaving. The low growl was still there, but the manic edge was gone, replaced by a questioning whine. Slowly, agonizingly, Titan stretched his neck forward. His wet, scarred nose touched the center of Thomas's open palm. Thomas didn't pet him. He just let his hand rest there, anchoring the broken dog to a reality that was finally quiet. Outside the cage, Eleanor had her hands clamped over her mouth, sobbing silently. Dr. Pendleton stared in utter shocked disbelief. his clipboard forgotten in his trembling hands. In the center of the cage, the blind seal and the condemned K9 stood together in the shadows, two casualties of a forgotten war, finding the only thing that could save them: each other. The silence in the isolation corridor of Freedom Forge was so profound it felt like a vacuum. Dr. Alex Pendleton was the first to break it, his voice a high-pitched stutter of sheer disbelief. "Get out of there!" Pendleton hissed, his hands pressed flat against the reinforced observation window of the door. "Mr. Mitchell, back away slowly. That animal is unpredictable. He's lulling you into a false sense of security." Thomas didn't move. His right hand remained firmly planted on the thick, scarred neck of the German shepherd. Beneath his palm, he could feel the erratic, jackhammer pounding of Titan's heart slowly beginning to regulate. The dog's wet nose nudged his fingers, a hesitant plea for anchoring in a world that had spun violently out of control. "He's not lulling me into anything, Doc," Thomas said, his voice echoing off the concrete. "He's doing exactly what I'm doing. He's breathing. Now, somebody get me a heavy-duty lead. We're going home." Pendleton's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. "Absolutely not. I am the chief veterinary officer of this facility, and I am telling you that dog is a level 5 liability. He is property of the Department of Defense, transferred to us for terminal evaluation. You cannot just walk in here, pet him once, and adopt a killing machine. It violates every protocol we have. You're blind, for God's sake. How are you going to manage a 100-pound tactical canine when you can't even see him lunging?" Outside the cage, Chief Petty Officer Ryan Garner stepped directly into Pendleton's personal space. Ryan wasn't a tall man, but he had the wide, dense build of a pit bull and eyes that had seen things Pendleton couldn't fathom. "Doc, take a step back and lower your voice," Ryan commanded, a dangerous edge in his tone. "That killing machine has 4 Bronze Stars with valor. He saved 14 men in the Arghandab Valley before he ever stepped foot in Mosul. And the man inside that cage has a Navy Cross. You're talking about liability? I'm talking about 2 veterans who just saved each other's lives. Now, go get the damn paperwork." Eleanor Moore, tears still drying on her cheeks, stepped between the 2 men. She looked at the cage. Titan had sat down, his heavy body leaning entirely against Thomas's left leg. It was a classic guard stance, but relaxed. The aggressive, foaming monster from 10 minutes ago was gone, replaced by a weary soldier leaning on a brother in arms. "Alex, he's right," Eleanor said, her voice trembling but gaining strength. "We scheduled Titan for euthanasia because he was a danger to everyone and had 0 quality of life. But look at him. He hasn't let a human touch him in 8 months without drawing blood. Thomas just walked in there blind. I'm overriding you, Alex. I have final say on adoptions. I am reporting this to the board, Eleanor," Pendleton snapped, turning on his heel. "When that dog tears his throat out in the middle of the night, the blood is on your hands, not mine." He stormed down the hallway, the heavy doors slamming behind him. The process of getting Titan out of the facility was agonizingly tense. Thomas insisted on clipping the heavy carabiner of the lead to Titan's collar himself. As the metal clicked, Titan stiffened, a low rumble starting in his chest, a phantom memory of being tethered to a helicopter floorboards under fire. Thomas immediately dropped to one knee, putting himself at eye level with the predator, a profoundly dangerous move for a blind man. He placed both hands firmly on Titan's shoulders. "Hey, listen to me," Thomas commanded softly. "We're leaving the wire. You and me. No more cages. No more doctors. Just the mountains. Stand down, Titan. We're Oscar Mike. Oscar Mike. On the move." It was a command Titan had heard 1,000 times from Chris Norton. Hearing it now, spoken with the calm, authoritative baritone of a DevGru operator, snapped the dog back to reality. Titan let out a long, shuddering breath and stood up. Walking out of Freedom Forge was a spectacle. Staff members peeked out of offices, stunned to see the demon dog walking shoulder to leg with the blind man. Titan wasn't a trained guide dog. He didn't know how to navigate Thomas around obstacles. But his military obedience training held firm. He matched Thomas's slow, deliberate pace perfectly. When they reached Ryan's F-150, a new problem arose. Titan refused to get in the back. He planted his paws on the asphalt, his eyes scanning the parking lot frantically, looking for snipers, looking for threats. "He hates vehicles," Eleanor whispered, having followed them out with a file of medical records. The last time he was in a truck, it was the medevac that took his handler away. "He's panicked." Thomas didn't force him. He opened the heavy rear door of the cab, sat down on the floorboards with his legs dangling out, and just waited. He patted the seat beside him once. "Clear. Buddy, it's clear." It took 20 agonizing minutes of silence in the cold Denver air. Finally, trembling violently, Titan crawled into the cab, curling his massive frame as tightly as possible against Thomas's side. Ryan put the truck in drive. As they pulled onto the highway heading toward the Rockies, Thomas ran his hand over the dog's scarred flank. He felt the jagged, raised tissue of shrapnel wounds. He felt the way the dog flinched at every pothole. They were two broken things heading into the woods. And Thomas, for the first time in 3 years, felt the heavy, comforting weight of responsibility. The first 48 hours at Thomas's isolated cabin in the foothills of Mount Evans were a masterclass in survival. The cabin was Thomas's sanctuary. He knew every creaky floorboard, every distance from the cast-iron stove to the leather armchair, and exactly how many steps it took to get from his bed to the back porch. He had mapped his darkness perfectly. But introducing a 100-pound, hyper-vigilant German shepherd into that delicate ecosystem threw everything off balance. The first night, the ghosts came. Around 2 a.m., a fast-moving front rolled down from the peaks, bringing a violent barrage of thunder. For Thomas, thunder was just a vibration in his chest. But for Titan, the rolling booms echoing off the canyon walls sounded exactly like incoming mortar fire. Thomas was jolted awake by a terrifying sound, a mixture of a howl and a scream. He threw his legs over the side of the bed, his bare feet hitting the cold pine floor. "Titan!" he called out. He heard the dog scramble frantically in the living room, claws tearing at the front door. Titan was trying to dig his way out of a bunker. He was trying to escape the blast zone. Thomas navigated the dark hallway swiftly, using the wall for guidance. When he reached the living room, he could hear Titan's ragged, hyperventilating breaths. "Titan, here!" Thomas commanded. The dog didn't respond. In the flashes of lightning that Thomas couldn't see, Titan was pacing the perimeter of the room, teeth bared at the windows, trapped in a flashback in Mosul. Thomas knew he couldn't corner him. A dog in a PTSD blind panic would bite whatever touched it. Instead, Thomas walked to the center of the room, sat cross-legged on the floor, and began to field strip his old service pistol. He didn't need the gun. He needed the sound. Clack. Slide. Click. The familiar, mechanical, rhythmic sound of a weapon being broken down and reassembled cut through the noise of the storm. It was the sound of a safe house. It was the sound of a platoon standing by. Slowly, the frantic pacing stopped. Thomas heard the heavy padding of paws approaching. He kept his hands moving over the cold steel of the slide. Click. Clack. A wet nose bumped his elbow. Titan collapsed onto the floor next to Thomas, his massive body shaking so hard it rattled the floorboards. Thomas set the slide down and buried his hands in the thick fur behind the dog's ears, applying deep, firm pressure. "Hold the line, buddy," Thomas whispered into the dark. They stayed on the floor until dawn. The real test, however, didn't come from the weather. It came 3 days later, in the form of a rusted-out Chevrolet Silverado grinding its way up Thomas's private gravel driveway. Thomas was on the back porch, drinking coffee, listening to the wind in the lodgepole pines. Titan was lying at his feet, chewing on a thick elk antler. As the sound of the engine approached, Titan's head snapped up. His ears swiveled. The antler dropped from his mouth. A low, vibrating growl started in his chest. This wasn't the frantic, terrified growl of his kennel days. This was focused. This was a threat assessment. Thomas stood up, his hand automatically reaching for his folding cane. "Easy," he murmured to the dog. The truck parked haphazardly near the front of the cabin. A door slammed. Heavy, unlaced boots crunched on the gravel. Thomas recognized the heavy, dragging footsteps. It was Cole Dawson. Dawson was a local squatter who lived in an RV down the mountain. He was known to local law enforcement for cooking meth and stealing copper wire from construction sites. Dawson knew Thomas was a blind, disabled veteran living alone. To a predator like Dawson, Thomas looked like an easy mark. "Hey there, Mitchell," Dawson called out, his voice raspy and falsely cheerful as he rounded the corner of the cabin. "Saw you got a delivery the other day. Just coming up to check on my favorite war hero, see if you needed any help around the place." Thomas could smell the stale alcohol and chemical sweat radiating off the man from 20 feet away. "You're trespassing, Dawson," Thomas said firmly, staying on the porch. "Turn around and get back in your truck. Now, Tommy, no need to be unneighborly," Dawson sneered, taking another few steps closer to the porch stairs. "I'm just a little short on cash this week. I know you got that nice big generator out back. Figure you don't need all that power just to sit in the dark. Thought I might take it off your hands for a fair price." Dawson took a step onto the bottom stair. He had a heavy steel tire iron gripped in his right hand. He figured he could walk right past the blind man, take what he wanted, and leave. He hadn't accounted for the shadow at Thomas's feet. As Dawson's boot hit the wood of the bottom step, Titan moved. It wasn't a frantic lunge. It was a precise, terrifying, tactical deployment. In a fraction of a second, the 100-pound German Shepherd placed himself directly between Thomas and the stairs. Titan didn't bark. He didn't snap. He simply dropped his head low, locked his amber eyes onto Dawson's throat, and let out a snarl that sounded like a chainsaw turning over in the depths of hell. Dawson froze violently. The color drained from his face. He had expected a helpless blind man. He was suddenly staring down the barrel of a military-grade apex predator. "Jesus Christ!" Dawson yelled, stumbling backward off the step, nearly tripping over his own boots. He raised the tire iron defensively. "Call off your damn dog, Mitchell." Titan stepped forward, his lips curled back to expose an immaculate, terrifying row of white teeth. He didn't break focus. He was waiting for one thing, and one thing only. The command to engage. Thomas stood perfectly still. He could hear Dawson's panicked breathing. He could feel the lethal tension radiating off Titan. He knew that with one word, Titan would neutralize the threat, and he would likely tear Dawson's arm off in the process. This was the moment. This was the razor's edge where Dr. Pendleton had predicted disaster. This was where the killing machine was supposed to take over. Thomas reached down. He placed 2 fingers lightly on the back of Titan's neck. "Stand down," Thomas commanded softly. Titan's jaws snapped shut. The snarl died in his throat. He took one step back, returning to Thomas's side, but he never took his eyes off Dawson. The broken dog who wouldn't listen to anyone had yielded his fury to the blind man's touch. "You heard him, Dawson," Thomas said, his voice cold as ice. "If you ever come up this driveway again, I won't give him the stand-down order. Get off my mountain." Dawson didn't say another word. He scrambled back to his rusted truck, threw it into reverse, and tore down the gravel driveway, spraying rocks into the brush. As the sound of the engine faded into the valley, Thomas knelt down on the porch. Titan immediately pressed his large head into Thomas's chest, letting out a long, heavy sigh. Thomas wrapped his arms around the dog, burying his face in the thick fur. They had survived the first ambush. But the real war, the battle to heal their broken minds, was only just beginning. The transition from a sterile, concrete kennel to the sprawling, untamed wilderness of the Colorado Rockies was a shock to Titan's highly regimented nervous system. For the first month, the dog treated the cabin like a forward operating base. He slept with one eye open, positioned strategically between the front door and Thomas's bedroom. He patrolled the perimeter of the deck every hour, his nose raised to catch the scent of mountain lions, black bears, or human intruders. Thomas, however, understood that a soldier without a mission quickly loses his mind. Titan didn't need a soft retirement. He needed a job, and Thomas desperately needed a spotter. Their training began not with standard guide dog protocols, but with the brutal, efficient logic of tactical military movement. Thomas couldn't see hand signals, and Titan was too traumatized to tolerate the rigid, restrictive harnesses used by civilian guide organizations. They had to invent their own language. Thomas ordered a heavy, custom-braided leather lead from a tactical outfitter in Virginia. It was 3 feet long, just enough to give Titan operational freedom, but short enough that the tension transferred perfectly to Thomas's hand. Their first real test was the terrain itself. Behind Thomas's cabin lay a jagged, uneven trail that wound up into the Arapahoe National Forest. It was littered with exposed roots, loose shale, and sudden drop-offs. For a blind man with a white cane, it was a minefield. "All right, Titan," Thomas said one crisp October morning, clipping the brass carabiner to the dog's heavy nylon collar. "Point." It was a DEVGRU command, telling the lead man to take the front and set the pace. Titan's ears snapped forward. He stepped ahead of Thomas, the leather lead pulling taut. As they moved up the trail, Thomas relied entirely on the sensory feedback traveling up that piece of leather. He learned to read the dog's movements like Braille. A sudden slack in the line meant Titan had stopped to assess a scent. A hard pull to the left meant a change in elevation, but the real breakthrough happened 2 miles up the ridge. The heavy autumn rains had washed out a section of the path, leaving a sheer 20-foot drop into a rocky ravine. Thomas's white cane was sweeping rhythmically, but the washout was undercut. The cane tapped solid dirt just inches before the void. Thomas stepped forward. His boot, finding nothing but empty air. He started to fall, gravity grabbing hold of his heavy frame. A civilian guide dog is trained to stop and block a handler from a ledge. Titan, however, was trained in combat extraction. The moment Thomas's weight shifted forward, he dropped his center of gravity, dug his massive claws deeply into the muddy trail, and lunged backward with explosive, bone-jarring force. The violent jerk on the heavy leather lead nearly dislocated Thomas's shoulder, but it arrested his momentum instantly. Titan let out a sharp, commanding bark, not of fear, but of absolute authority, and physically threw his 100-pound body against Thomas's shins, knocking the former SEAL backward onto the solid, muddy ground. Thomas lay on his back, his chest heaving, the sound of the loose rocks tumbling down the ravine echoing in his ears. He reached out with trembling hands. Titan was instantly there, his wet nose pressing firmly into Thomas's neck, sniffing frantically for blood or injury. "Good boy," Thomas breathed, wrapping his arms around the dog's thick neck. From that day forward, the dynamic shifted. Titan stopped acting like he was guarding a VIP and started acting like he was leading a squad. He began to understand the purpose of the white cane, watching how Thomas used it to read the ground. Soon, Titan preempted the cane. If a low-hanging pine branch threatened Thomas's face, Titan would lean his heavy shoulder into Thomas's thigh, steering him off the vector before the cane even registered the obstacle. They developed a symbiotic rhythm. Thomas grounded Titan in the present, snapping him out of flashbacks with the calm, steady cadence of his voice and the rhythmic stripping of his service pistol. In return, Titan gave Thomas back the world. The dog became Thomas's eyes, his early warning system, and his silent shadow warrior. But their isolated peace was fragile, and the Rocky Mountains in November are entirely unforgiving. The storm didn't arrive with a warning. It slammed into the front range like a freight train of white ice. Meteorologists in Denver called it a bomb cyclone. Within 3 hours, the temperature plummeted to 9 degrees, and the wind howled at 60 miles per hour, burying the mountain roads in blinding, horizontal snow. Thomas was inside, feeding the cast iron stove with split oak. Titan was curled on a braided rug nearby, the heat radiating off his scarred coat. The peace of the cabin was abruptly shattered by the harsh, vibrating buzz of the satellite emergency phone mounted on the kitchen wall. Thomas navigated the room quickly and picked up the heavy receiver. Mitchell. Static hissed violently on the other end, punctuated by the sound of failing metal and screaming wind. Tommy. The voice was faint, choked with pain. Ryan? Garner, is that you? Thomas gripped the phone, his heart rate instantly spiking. Hit black ice. Truck rolled. Off the embankment. Ryan's words were disjointed. Pinned. Legs are pinned. Heater's dead. Tommy, I'm freezing. Where are you, Ryan? Give me a coordinate, Thomas barked, slipping immediately back into the authoritative cadence of a chief petty officer. Mile marker. 14. The hairpin. The line went dead. Thomas slammed the receiver down. Mile marker 14 was exactly 2 miles down the mountain from his driveway. It was a treacherous stretch of road known locally as the Devil's Spine, a sharp, descending curve with a steep ravine on one side. In normal conditions, it was a 5-minute drive. In a bomb cyclone, with zero visibility and roads buried in 2 feet of powder, emergency services wouldn't be able to get a snowcat up the mountain for at least 4 hours. Ryan, bleeding and trapped in a metal box in sub-zero temperatures, would be dead from hypothermia in 1. Thomas didn't hesitate. He stripped off his flannel shirt and pulled on his heavy, military-issue extreme cold weather gear. He strapped his tactical medical kit to his thigh and grabbed a heavy coil of climbing rope. Titan was already on his feet. The dog sensed the chemical spike of adrenaline in Thomas's sweat. He paced the kitchen, a low, anxious whine vibrating in his throat. The howling wind outside sounded too much like the roar of the rotors in Mosul. "Gear up, buddy," Thomas commanded, holding out the heavy leather lead. Titan hesitated, his amber eyes locked on the front door, shivering. Thomas knelt down, finding the dog's face with his hands. "I can't find him without you. I need my eyes." Titan. "Are we Oscar Mike?" Titan let out a huff of breath, stepped forward, and allowed Thomas to clip the lead to his collar. Stepping out onto the porch was like stepping into a frozen jet engine. The wind physically pushed Thomas backward. The cold was a living thing, biting through his heavy gloves. For a blind man, a blizzard is the ultimate sensory deprivation. The snow muffled the echoes he used to judge distance, and the wind tore away the ambient sounds of the forest. Thomas was entirely, terrifyingly blind. "Track!" Thomas yelled over the roaring wind. "Find Ryan!" Titan lowered his head, plowing through snow that reached his chest. He couldn't see much better than Thomas in the whiteout, but his nose was a biological miracle. He locked onto the faint, dissipating scent of Ryan's truck tires and the metallic tang of spilled antifreeze. They fought their way down the gravel driveway, leaning into the wind. Every step was a battle. Thomas relied completely on the tension of the leather strap. Several times, Thomas stumbled into deep drifts, and each time, Titan stood firm, acting as a living anchor to pull the heavy man upright. It took them 40 agonizing minutes to cover the 2 miles to the hairpin turn. Thomas's face was numb, his eyelashes frozen together. Suddenly, Titan stopped dead. The leash went rigid. "What is it?" Thomas yelled. Titan barked a sharp, frantic sound aimed down toward the right side of the road. The dog began to pull hard toward the edge of the embankment. Thomas dropped to his knees. Sweeping his hands over the edge, he found the sheer drop-off, and beneath his thick gloves, He felt the deep, fresh gouges in the frozen earth where a heavy vehicle had slid over the side. Good boy, stay close. Thomas tied one end of his climbing rope to a massive, wind-battered spruce tree on the edge of the road and clipped the other to his heavy belt. "Guide me down," Thomas ordered. Titan scrambled over the edge. The descent was brutal. The ravine was a 40-degree slope of ice and jagged rocks hidden by snow. They slid, scrambled, and fought for every inch. 50 feet down, the smell hit Titan. It wasn't just antifreeze anymore. It was the sharp, coppery scent of fresh human blood. Instantly, Titan froze. The leather lead dropped slack. The dog began to whine, a high, panicked pitch. In his damaged mind, the freezing ravine dissolved. The snow turned to desert dust. The howling wind became the sound of incoming RPGs. He was back in the compound. His handler was bleeding out, and death was closing in. Titan spun in a tight circle, snapping blindly at the freezing air, his mind completely hijacked by the trauma. "Titan!" Thomas shouted, feeling the erratic, panicked jerks on the leash. "Titan, look at me! Come back!" Thomas pulled himself down the rope hand over hand, sliding on his knees until he collided with the heavy metal frame of the overturned F-150. He reached out and grabbed Titan's collar, pulling the panicked, snapping dog against his chest. "Listen to me," Thomas roared over the blizzard, burying his face in the dog's snow-caked fur. "Norton is gone. Mosul is gone. You are in Colorado. I am right here. I have you," Titan thrashed, his powerful jaws snapping inches from Thomas's face, trapped in the nightmare. "You're not losing another one," Thomas screamed, shaking the dog. "Ryan is in this truck. Do your job, soldier. Do your job." The command, delivered with the absolute, uncompromising authority of a SEAL team leader, cut through the panic like a scalpel. Titan gasped, his eyes focusing in the whiteout. The desert vanished. The snow returned. He felt the heavy, reassuring weight of Thomas's hands on him. Titan stopped thrashing. He let out a long, shuddering whine, licked the freezing snow off Thomas's cheek, and immediately turned toward the crushed cab of the truck. Titan wedged his head through the shattered driver's side window, sniffing frantically until he found Ryan's face. He let out a loud, sustained bark to guide Thomas to the opening. Thomas pulled himself up to the window. "Ryan, sound off." "Tommy," Ryan coughed, his voice barely a whisper. "Knew you'd come. My eyes found you," Thomas grunted, reaching in to feel the crushed dashboard pinning Ryan's legs. In the howling darkness of the freezing ravine, the blind man and the broken dog set to work, proving that sometimes the most shattered things are the strongest ones left standing. The crushed cab of the Ford F-150 smelled of copper, ruptured battery acid, and the terrifying, sharp tang of freezing death. Thomas Mitchell wedged his upper body through the shattered driver's side window, his heavy, cold-weather gloves blindly mapping the jagged, catastrophic ruin of the dashboard. "Tommy." "My legs." Ryan Garner's voice was a frail, wet rasp. The dense, muscular chief petty officer was rapidly losing his battle against hemorrhagic shock and hypothermia. "I've got you, brother." "I'm right here," Thomas said, his voice a steady, vibrating anchor in the screaming wind. His hands found the steering column. It was bowed completely downward, pinning Ryan's thighs against the crumpled seat. Thomas pulled a heavy steel pry bar from his tactical thigh rig, a tool he had carried on a dozen hostage rescues in the Middle East. He wedged the flat edge beneath the crushed steering column. "I'm going to pry this up. When the pressure lifts, you have to pull yourself back. Can you do that, Ryan?" "Can't." "Feel him, Tommy." "I can't move." A sickening crack echoed through the ravine, louder than the howling wind. The entire chassis of the truck groaned, sliding another agonizing foot down the 40-degree icy slope. The impact had destabilized the frozen soil beneath the tires. Gravity was claiming its prize. They had minutes, perhaps seconds, before the 3-ton vehicle plummeted the remaining 100 feet to the rocky bottom of the gorge. Thomas realized with a cold, terrifying clarity that he couldn't do this alone. He couldn't hold the pry bar with enough leverage to lift the mangled steel and simultaneously drag a 200-pound bleeding man out of the window. He needed a winch. He needed his point man. Thomas pulled himself out of the window. The snow was blowing horizontally, coating him in a sheet of white. Titan, front and center, the German shepherd, who had been anxiously pacing the perimeter of the wreck, instantly closed the distance, his heavy head pressing firmly against Thomas's thigh. Thomas quickly unspooled the remaining length of his climbing rope. He reached into the cab, looping the heavy nylon tightly around the tactical harness Ryan always wore over his winter coat. He locked the carabiner with a sharp click. Then, Thomas took the other end of the rope, feeling blindly for the heavy brass D-ring on Titan's thick leather collar. He threaded the rope through it, tying a reinforced slip knot. "Listen to me, Titan," Thomas roared over the blizzard, grabbing the dog by the thick fur on both sides of his face, pulling him close until he could feel the animal's hot breath on his frozen cheeks. "I am going to lift the steel. When I yell, you pull. Do you understand me? You do not stop pulling until he is out of the wire. We do not leave our men behind." Titan let out a low, vibrating growl, a sound completely devoid of panic. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated focus. The dog backed up until the rope between him and Ryan went taut. He lowered his front half, digging his massive paws deep into the frozen dirt and snow, his back muscles bunching like coiled steel cables. Thomas leaned back into the window, wedging the pry bar perfectly under the column. He planted his boots against the interior of the doorframe. He took a massive breath of freezing air. "Pull, Titan. Pull." Thomas threw every ounce of his massive frame onto the pry bar. His shoulders screamed in agony, the muscles tearing as he forced the mangled steel upward. Outside, the 100-pound apex predator erupted. Titan didn't just pull. He threw himself backward with explosive, concussive force. His claws tore through the ice, finding traction in the frozen bedrock. The dog snarled, his jaws clamped tight, pulling the rope with a violence born from years of combat training. Inside the cab, the steering column shrieked, bending upward under Thomas's relentless pressure by a single, vital inch. It was enough. Titan's sheer pulling power yanked Ryan upward and backward. The injured seal cried out in agony as his legs scraped free of the crushing metal. But the momentum didn't stop. Titan hauled backward, dragging the 200-pound man entirely out of the shattered window, sliding him onto the snow-covered embankment just as the ice beneath the truck finally gave way. Thomas threw himself backward out of the window, landing heavily in the snow beside Ryan. A deafening roar of grinding metal and snapping branches swallowed the sound of the wind. Thomas and Titan lay flat as the F-150 tore loose from the embankment, plummeting the rest of the way down the ravine, crashing violently into the rocks below. Silence fell over the ledge. Save for the howling wind, Thomas reached out blindly. His hand found Ryan's chest, feeling the ragged, shallow rise and fall. Alive. A wet nose forcefully nudged Thomas's cheek. Titan stood over them, panting heavily, the rope still pulled taut. The dog hadn't flinched. The dog hadn't run. The broken soldier had held the line. "Good boy," Thomas gasped, his voice breaking. "Good boy." But the battle wasn't over. They were 50 feet down a sheer icy drop, and Ryan was bleeding out in sub-zero temperatures. Thomas hauled Ryan onto his shoulders in a brutal fireman's carry. He grabbed the main line he had tied to the spruce tree at the top of the road. "Point, Titan. Take us home," Thomas commanded. The ascent was a nightmare of frozen mud, slipping boots, and burning lungs. Titan stayed directly in front of Thomas, the leather lead taut, mapping the safest footholds, using his own body weight to help drag Thomas forward when the heavy man's boots lost purchase on the ice. They fought for an hour to climb 50 feet. When they finally collapsed onto the edge of the asphalt at mile marker 14, the storm was beginning to break. Thomas dragged Ryan into the lee of a massive boulder to block the wind. He wrapped his own heavy coat around his friend. "Titan," Thomas whispered, his body shivering uncontrollably. "Cover." The massive German shepherd didn't hesitate. He curled his 100-pound, heat-radiating body tightly over Ryan's chest and legs, shielding the dying man from the plunging temperatures, his amber eyes scanning the dark, snowy road for threats. Thomas sat beside them, a blind sentinel in the dark, waiting for the dawn. The flashing red and blue lights of the Clear Creek County Rescue Convoy pierced the whiteout just after 5 a.m. When the paramedics fought their way off the snowcat, they stopped dead in their tracks. Huddled against a boulder was a massive, scarred German shepherd, aggressively guarding two unconscious men. As the first EMT stepped forward, Titan raised his head. He simply let out a single, sharp bark, and then stepped back, nudging Thomas's frozen hand with his nose to wake him. The dog knew the uniform. He knew the cavalry had arrived. The emergency room at Denver General was a chaotic blur of heat, shouting nurses, and the sharp smell of iodine. Thomas sat in a hard plastic chair in the corner of the trauma wing, an IV pumping warm fluids into his arm to combat the mild frostbite on his face and hands. He refused a bed. He sat rigidly upright, his white cane resting against his knee, and lying across both of Thomas's boots, completely ignoring the frantic rush of gurneys and screaming monitors, was Titan. The door to the waiting room burst open. Eleanor Moore and Dr. Alex Pendleton rushed in, having received the frantic call from the local sheriff's department. Eleanor fell to her knees in front of Thomas, tears streaming down her face as she looked at the dog. Titan calmly lifted his head, sniffed Eleanor's hand, and then rested his chin back on Thomas's boot. "Thomas, the police told us what happened. They said the truck was completely crushed at the bottom of the ravine. They said you pulled him out." Eleanor choked on a sob. "I didn't pull him out, Eleanor," Thomas said softly, his sightless eyes facing forward. He reached down, his fingers burying into the thick fur of Titan's neck. "My point man did." "Doctor." Pendleton stood frozen in the center of the waiting room. The behaviorist stared at the dog he had condemned to death just months prior. He looked at the heavy climbing rope burns on the dog's harness, the exhausted but profoundly calm demeanor of the animal. This wasn't a level 5 liability. This was a savior. "Mr. Mitchell," Dr. Pendleton started, his voice cracking with the heavy weight of absolute humility. I owe you an apology. And I owe him one. I looked at his trauma, and I only saw a weapon that couldn't be disarmed." Thomas didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice. He just nodded slowly. "You didn't know how to speak his language, Doc. He didn't need to be disarmed. He just needed a new mission." Later that evening, a surgeon emerged from the double doors. Ryan had suffered crushed femurs, a collapsed lung, and severe blood loss, but he was stable. He was going to live. 6 months later, the spring sun baked the damp earth of the Arapahoe National Forest. The snow was a distant memory, replaced by the sharp, pine-scented breeze of the high country. Thomas Mitchell sat on the porch of his cabin, a steaming mug of black coffee in his hand. He wasn't wearing his tactical gear. He was in a faded t-shirt and jeans. The rigid, defensive posture that had defined his life for 3 years was gone. Beside him sat Titan. The dog looked entirely different. The manic, paranoid glint in his amber eyes had been replaced by a quiet, calculating intelligence. His coat, once patchy and scarred, had grown out thick and healthy. Strapped comfortably to his chest was a heavy-duty, custom leather harness. Sewn into the side of it was a patch, Service K9, Do Not Pet. They had received a formal commendation from the governor's office, and Freedom Forge had fundamentally restructured their evaluation program for combat-traumatized K9S, using Titan's remarkable rehabilitation as the new standard. The sound of a truck tires crunched on the gravel driveway. Titan's ears perked up, but he didn't growl. He stood up calmly, placing his body gently against Thomas's leg, waiting for the command. "It's just Ryan, buddy. Stand by man," Thomas smiled, feeling the vibration of the customized truck Ryan now drove with hand controls. Ryan climbed out, leaning heavily on two aluminum forearm crutches. He navigated the gravel slowly, making his way to the porch. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at the blind man and the massive dog. "Looking good, Tommy," Ryan grinned, breathless from the effort. Titan wagged his tail, a slow, sweeping thump against the wooden floorboards. Thomas reached down, his fingers finding the heavy brass handle of Titan's harness. He stood up, stepping confidently toward the edge of the porch, guided entirely by the subtle, perfect tension of the leather. "We're doing all right, Ryan," Thomas said, the sunlight warming his scarred face. He couldn't see the mountains, but for the first time since the blast in Kandahar, he wasn't trapped in the dark. He had his brother back. And he had his eyes. The story of Thomas and Titan is a powerful testament to the resilience of the warrior spirit, regardless of species. Society often looks at shattered things, whether a blinded veteran or a deeply traumatized combat dog, and assumes they are beyond repair. But healing doesn't always come from soft hands and sterile rooms. Sometimes it comes from stepping back into the fire with someone who understands exactly how badly it burns. Thomas didn't try to fix Titan by treating him like a pet, and Titan didn't pity Thomas for his blindness. Instead, they forged a new chain of command based on mutual survival, proving that trauma doesn't end a soldier's usefulness. It merely demands a new mission.